There are a million ways to leave this world, but the 10 people in this video chose from the bottom of the barrel. These aren't tragic accidents, they're masterpieces of miscalculation, blueprints for the dumbest ways to die. A friendly warning. This is a historical review of bad ideas, not a list of suggestions. 1. In a quiet, maple-lined suburb in Canada, a man named Gord was a patriot of the most dangerous sort. An ambitious one. With the annual Canada Day celebration approaching, Gord felt a familiar sense of civic disappointment. His town's official fireworks display, in his expert opinion, was a soulless, predictable affair, an uninspired pop and fizzle that lacked true Canadian spirit. Gord, a self-proclaimed pyrotechnician whose laboratory was his cluttered garage, knew he could do better. He decided to gift his town a spectacle it would never forget. He would forge his own firework, a single, massive, awe-inspiring rocket that would put the officially sanctioned show to shame. He christened his project the Maple Leaf Marauder. It was a beast, the product of weeks of obsessive work, constructed from a thick PVC drainage pipe, a meticulously crafted balsa wood nose cone, and a homemade rocket fuel he had perfected through a series of increasingly alarming small-scale explosions in his backyard. This was to be his magnum opus. On the evening of Canada Day, as the neighborhood filled with the smell of sizzling burgers and the sound of cheerful celebration, Gord unveiled his creation. It was a 5-foot-tall monument to questionable life choices. He planted his launch tube in the center of his lawn, aimed it skyward, and with the theatrical flair of a master showman, he lit the fuse. The rocket erupted with a deafening, guttural roar, leaving a thick plume of white smoke in its wake as it shot beautifully into the twilight sky. It was a perfect, majestic launch. Gord felt a surge of pure, unadulterated patriotic pride, his heart swelling. He had done it! He was a hero. The rocket climbed, a perfect, unwavering arrow. Then, at the very peak of its flight, where it was supposed to burst into a glorious, shimmering red maple leaf, it simply stopped. The engine sputtered, died, and for a long, silent moment, the rocket hung suspended in the air, a dark, impotent shape against the dying light. Then, gravity, the eternal and undefeated critic of all amateur rocketry, began its work. The Maple Leaf Marauder, no longer a majestic symbol of national pride, but a 5-foot unguided missile, tipped over in a slow, sickening arc and began its descent. It came whistling back to Earth, a fiery omen returning to its creator with a vengeance. With a final, tragic scream, it landed directly on the roof of Gord's own house. The impact smashed through the shingles, and the rocket's unspent, highly flammable fuel and still-hot engine instantly ignited the dry attic timbers. Within seconds, his house was an inferno. The very firework he had built to outshine the town's uninspired display had created a deeply personal, wildly inspired blaze, a towering pillar of orange flame that was, without a doubt, the most memorable and talked-about spectacle of the entire evening. 2. The Canadian winter is a formidable, relentless force, capable of locking the landscape in a thick, unyielding grip of ice. For a man named Frank, a passionate fisherman, the frozen waterway that separated him from his beloved fishing spots was a personal enemy. He was consumed by an impatient longing for the spring thaw. But this year, he decided he would not wait for nature's slow, methodical schedule. He was going to create his own spring with chemistry. While others might have considered an ice auger or a chainsaw, Frank was a man who believed in overwhelming force. His chosen tool for his war against winter was thermite. For the uninitiated, thermite is not a gentle de-icer. It is a terrifyingly potent pyrotechnic composition of metal powder and metal oxide that, when ignited, burns at a temperature exceeding 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt through solid steel. Frank, having acquired a large bucket of the substance from a dubious online supplier, saw it as the ultimate solution. He marched out onto the frozen waterway, the ice a solid, 3-foot-thick sheet of blue-white armor. He placed the bucket of thermite on the exact spot he wished to clear for his boat, and with a long-handled lighter, he ignited the fuse. The reaction was not a fire, it was a miniature sun. A blindingly brilliant pillar of white-hot light erupted, so intense it seared the eyes, and a shower of molten metal sparks cascaded onto the ice. The thermite roared to life, and the ice directly beneath it didn't just melt, it vaporized, instantly creating the deep, dark channel of water he craved. Frank watched with a triumphant, godlike grin. He had commanded the elements. He had bent winter to his will. But he had made a critical, fatal miscalculation. The intense, 4,000-degree heat didn't just travel downwards, it radiated outwards in all directions, a rapidly expanding, invisible circle of thermal devastation. The solid, 3-foot-thick ice in a large radius around the burning bucket began to rapidly lose its structural integrity, turning from solid rock to rotten slush in a matter of seconds. The very patch of ice he was standing on, which had felt like a concrete slab moments before, gave way. He plunged with a shocked gasp into the frigid black water he had been so desperate to reach. His triumphant grin was instantly replaced by the silent, agonizing shock of hypothermia. But his ordeal was made infinitely worse by his own creation. The bucket of thermite, still burning with the fury of a collapsed star, sank with him, a personal, hellish underwater flare, turning his watery grave into a boiling, chaotic cauldron. He had wanted to melt a path for his boat, but all he managed to do was melt a permanent fiery hole for himself. 3. The old, abandoned smokestack stood like a 200-foot-tall brick sentinel, a forgotten monument to a dead industry. For a group of local teenagers, it was their secret castle, and the terrifying, rusted external ladder that snaked up its side was their rite of passage. For a teenager named Leo, reaching the top on this breezy afternoon was a moment of pure, king-of-the-world triumph. He stood on the narrow metal ring at the summit, the wind pulling at his clothes, the world a miniature map below. He had conquered the giant. But the slow, painstaking 200-foot climb back down seemed like a boring, anticlimactic chore. As he looked at the long, vertical ladder, a terrible, brilliant idea, born of youthful arrogance and a complete disregard for the laws of physics, took root. He was going to put on a show for his friends who were already at the bottom. He wasn't going to climb down. He was going to slide down, gripping the 2 vertical rails like a fireman on a brass pole. It would be fast. It would be cool. It would be legendary. He shouted his plan down to his friends, who responded with a mixture of cheers and nervous, unintelligible warnings that were snatched away by the wind. Leo took their distant shouts as encouragement. He swung his body into the space between the rails, gripped them tightly, and with a whoop of pure adrenalized joy, he began his descent. For the first 30 feet, it was everything he had imagined. A thrilling, controlled slide, the wind whistling past his ears. He was an action hero. But then, the undefeated, non-negotiable law of gravitational acceleration began to assert its dominance. His speed began to build, then multiply, shifting from thrilling to alarming, and then to outright terrifying. The smooth slide became a violent, bone-rattling plummet. The friction of his hands against the cold, rusty steel was immense, creating a searing heat, but it was no match for the relentless pull of the earth. His hands, now slick with sweat and burning with pain, began to lose their grip. The rungs of the ladder, which he was supposed to be clear of, became a rhythmic, brutal series of impacts against his back and legs. He was no longer a cool fireman. He was a human pinball in a vertical 200-foot machine. Panic flooded his system. He tried to squeeze harder, to use his shoes as brakes, but it was like trying to stop a speeding car by dragging your feet. The velocity was simply uncontrollable. Finally, his burning, blistered hands could hold on no longer. They were ripped from the rails. For a single, horrifying moment, he was launched away from the smokestack, a human projectile arcing out into the empty sky as his friends' cheers turned to screams of pure horror. His journey down, which he had intended as a legendary shortcut, had indeed been much, much faster than climbing. 4. In the dead of a Tuesday night, in the sprawling, quiet suburbs of Ohio, the world for 21-year-old Kyle and his friends had shrunk to the cramped, stale interior of a beat-up minivan. They were adrift in a sea of youthful boredom, a state of mind that often serves as the fertile ground for profoundly stupid ideas. Their mission for the evening, a time-honored rite of passage for disaffected rural youth, was the systematic destruction of mailboxes. armed with a crate of cheap beer and a pile of jagged rocks collected from a construction site, they were waging a small, pointless war against civic property. Kyle, designated as the artillery, was getting frustrated. Perched in the passenger seat of the sliding side door, he found his performance hampered by the vehicle's architecture. He couldn't get a full, satisfying windup. His throws were weak, rushed, and often inaccurate, resulting in glancing blows rather than the glorious, metal-denting impacts he craved. "I need more room," he announced, his words slightly slurred. "I can't get any power." And in that moment, a plan of sheer, unadulterated genius was born. He would simply slide the side door open. It seemed so obvious. This would transform his cramped seat into a mobile, open-air gunner's platform, offering an unrestricted field of fire. His friends, operating on the same level of intellectual brilliance, unanimously agreed it was a fantastic idea. The driver, keeping a steady 40 miles per hour, held the wheel as Kyle wrestled with the heavy door, sliding it open with a loud thunk. The cool night air roared into the van, whipping their hair and filling the space with the smell of asphalt and damp earth. Kyle shifted his position, now sitting sideways on the edge of his seat, his feet braced against the van's interior, the rushing, dark pavement a mere blur just inches below him. He was no longer just a joyrider, he was an operator, a specialist. He spotted his next target, a proud faux brick mailbox, the kind that screamed suburban stability. This would be his masterpiece. He selected a rock with a satisfying heft and began his windup. He leaned his upper body out into the rushing wind, twisting at the waist, pulling his arm back like a major league pitcher about to throw a fastball. He felt a surge of power, a feeling of pure, unbridled chaos. He was in his element. He unleashed the throw, a violent whipping motion that put his entire body into the effort. The rock shot from his hand like a cannonball, a perfect, speeding projectile that would, in a few seconds, obliterate its target. But Kyle had made a fatal miscalculation. He had failed to account for Sir Isaac Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The powerful, outward flinging force he had generated to propel the rock forward was now acting on his own body. That force, combined with his precarious, off-balance position and the van's forward momentum, created a perfect storm of kinetic energy. His body, following the exact same arc as his throwing arm, was helplessly flung outwards and away from the vehicle. His friends could only watch in a moment of stunned, slow-motion horror as he was ejected from the van, a human catapult of his own design. He had been so laser-focused on weaponizing the laws of physics to destroy a mailbox that he had completely forgotten that he too was subject to those very same laws. A final, brutal lesson that momentum is always a two-way street. 5. Indian weddings are legendary spectacles of joy, a vibrant, multi-day explosion of color, music, and tradition. At one such lavish celebration, a guest named Raj was embracing the festive spirit with a particular and reckless abandon. Fueled by a river of complimentary whiskey, he had moved beyond cheerful celebration and into the realm of performative bravado. A key element of the wedding's grand procession had been a majestic camel, a creature adorned in rich, embroidered fabrics and tinkling silver bells, a living symbol of desert royalty. As the night wore on and the formal ceremonies gave way to a wilder party, the camel stood patiently tethered to a post, an island of stoic calm in a sea of chaos. Raj, however, saw not a symbol of dignity, but a challenge, an opportunity. In his heavily intoxicated mind, a brilliant idea took shape. He would ride the camel. It would be hilarious. It would be legendary. He would be the hero of the wedding. He announced his grand plan to a cheering circle of equally inebriated friends who slapped him on the back and urged him onward. Ignoring the frantic, waving protests of the camel's handler, Raj took a running start. With a surprising burst of drunken agility, he managed to scramble onto the camel's back, landing heavily on the ornate saddle. The camel, a creature of habit and calm, was utterly unprepared for this sudden, aggressive violation of its personal space. A loud, unbalanced, and very drunk man was now on its back, whooping and pulling at its decorative reins. The animal's ancient, hardwired survival instincts instantly took over. It saw a predator, a threat, and it reacted with pure, unthinking panic. It let out a deep, guttural bellow of alarm and exploded into a violent rampage. It was no longer a docile wedding decoration. It was 1,000 pounds of terrified, stampeding beast. It bucked and spun in a desperate, frantic attempt to dislodge the unwelcome rider. Raj's drunken rodeo fantasy collided with a much more brutal reality. He held on for a few terrifying, bone-jarring seconds before being unceremoniously launched through the air, landing in a crumpled heap on the ground. The crowd of wedding guests screamed and scattered as the panicked animal, now completely untethered, continued its rampage through the beautifully arranged tables and decorations. The camel, in its blind terror, saw the crumpled figure on the ground as the lingering source of its distress. In a final, tragic act of defensive aggression, it charged and trampled him before the horrified handler and other guests could intervene. Raj's quest for a fleeting moment of drunken glory, his attempt to become the unforgettable star of the wedding, had succeeded in the most gruesome way imaginable. He had mistaken a powerful, majestic animal for a mechanical bull, a fatal error in judgment that turned a celebration of life into a scene of shocking and utterly preventable death. 6. There are certain combinations that exist in a realm of such obvious, self-evident stupidity that it's a wonder they even need to be warned against. A moped on a high-speed train track is one such combination. In a sleepy German town, a man named Klaus was a creature of habit and impatience. His primary mode of transportation was a sputtering 50cc moped, a vehicle that moved with all the urgency of a tired glacier. One afternoon, he found his route to the beer garden blocked by a railway crossing. The red lights were flashing, the barriers were down, and the distant electronic chime signaled the approach of a train. For any rational person, this was a clear signal to wait the required 2 minutes. For Klaus, it was an intolerable delay, a personal affront by the German railway system. He looked down the long, straight, and seemingly empty stretch of track, and a thought, a terrible and profoundly lazy thought, began to form. Why wait? The tracks, he reasoned, were a perfectly good, if slightly bumpy, shortcut to the next crossing, a private expressway just for him. He saw the parallel steel rails not as the designated path for a 200-ton steel behemoth, moving at over 100 miles per hour, but as a convenient, albeit unconventional, moped lane. With a sigh of frustration at the law-abiding sheep waiting in their cars, he deftly maneuvered his tiny moped around the lowered barrier and onto the gravel railbed. The ride was jarring, his small tires slipping on the loose stones, but he was moving. He was beating the system. He probably imagined the accolades he would receive at the beer garden for his clever, time-saving maneuver. He failed to appreciate the deceptive physics of a modern inner-city express train. They are incredibly fast, and due to their advanced aerodynamics, they are unnervingly quiet until they are almost on top of you. By the time the deafening, earth-shattering blast of the train's horn finally registered in Klaus's brain, it was no longer a warning. It was a final, brutal announcement. He glanced over his shoulder, and his smug satisfaction was instantly vaporized by a vision of pure, mechanical horror. The train, which had been a distant speck just seconds before, was now a monstrous, rapidly expanding wall of metal, consuming the track behind him with terrifying speed. There was no time to swerve, no time to think, no time to even scream. He and his tiny moped, a fragile pairing of man and machine, were simply and utterly erased from the tracks in a violent, instantaneous collision of mass. His clever shortcut, designed to save him a mere 2 minutes of waiting, had, in the final accounting, cost him the rest of his life. He had treated a high-speed railway as a quiet country lane, a fatal miscalculation that provided a grim final lesson in the vast, unbridgeable difference between a moped and a locomotive. 7. A wedding is a celebration of life, love, and new beginnings, usually marked by toasts, dancing, and perhaps a few tasteful fireworks. In a small village in Serbia, however, a man named Dragan, the proud father of the groom, felt that such conventional celebrations were woefully inadequate. His son's wedding, he believed, demanded a display of joy and pride on a much grander, more military scale. Dragan was a man of extravagant gestures and questionable connections. He decided that the only fitting way to salute the happy couple was by firing a 20mm anti-aircraft gun into the air. He had somehow acquired the weapon, a relic of a past conflict, and a belt of high-explosive incendiary rounds. To him, this wasn't an act of reckless endangerment. It was the ultimate party favor, a truly unforgettable wedding salute. As the wedding party reached its peak, with music playing and guests celebrating in the open courtyard, Drunken unveiled his surprise. He had set up the formidable weapon on a small hill overlooking the festivities. With a triumphant yell to his son, he took his seat behind the gun, aimed it at the clear night sky, and pulled the trigger. A deafening, rhythmic thump-thump-thump echoed through the valley as a stream of tracer rounds shot into the heavens. The crowd below cheered, their upturned faces illuminated by the fiery spectacle. It was a breathtaking, if terrifying, display. But Drunken was using old, poorly stored surplus ammunition, a fact he had either ignored or was blissfully unaware of. One of the high-explosive shells in the belt was faulty. Instead of rocketing thousands of feet into the air before harmlessly self-destructing, this particular round's fuse malfunctioned. It exploded prematurely just a few hundred feet above the wedding party. The sky, which had been filled with celebratory streaks of light, was suddenly filled with a deadly rain of red-hot shrapnel and incandescent fragments. The cheers of the wedding guests instantly turned to screams of terror and pain, as the very celebration Drunken had sought to amplify with his grand gesture was turned into a scene of chaos and tragedy. His attempt to create an unforgettable wedding for his son had succeeded in the most horrific way imaginable, a brutal and instantaneous lesson that some party favors are best left in the armory. 8. In the rolling pastoral hills of rural Romania, a man named Ion was not a master thief. He was at best a clumsy and deeply unimaginative opportunist. One evening, driven by a desire for a free meal, he decided he was going to steal a sheep from his neighbor's pasture. His plan had no subtlety, no cleverness. It was a simple, brute force operation. He would sneak into the field, grab a sheep, and carry it home. He successfully navigated the fence and found himself in a field of blissfully unaware, grazing sheep. He targeted a plump, healthy-looking ewe, and after a brief, comical chase, he managed to tackle it. Now came the hard part: transportation. Instead of trying to lead the animal, Ion, in a feat of pure, stubborn strength, decided the most efficient method would be to hoist the struggling 100-pound animal onto his back and carry it, like a giant, woolly backpack, the mile back to his cottage. The sheep, understandably, was not a willing participant in this arrangement. It kicked, it squirmed, it bleated in terror, making Ion's journey a precarious, stumbling ordeal. As he made his way across a dark, unfamiliar part of the pasture, his path took him past an old, abandoned well. The well was a deep, stone-lined shaft, its opening flush with the ground and partially obscured by overgrown weeds. In the darkness, Ion didn't see it. The sheep, in a particularly violent struggle, shifted its weight, throwing Ion completely off balance. He stumbled sideways, his foot finding nothing but the empty black void of the well's opening. He and his woolly burden plunged into the darkness, landing with a splash in the icy, murky water 20 feet below. The shock of the cold water and the impact dazed him. The sheep, still strapped to his back, thrashed wildly in panic, its heavy, waterlogged fleece acting as an anchor, pushing him under. He was now trapped at the bottom of a deep, narrow well, in the dark, with a terrified 200-pound, when wet, sheep on his back, a situation for which no survival manual has ever been written. He was unable to get the animal off of him, and he was unable to climb the slick, mossy stones of the well wall. His simple plan for a free dinner had devolved into a bizarre, subterranean nightmare. He was found 2 days later, a tragic, waterlogged victim of his own clumsy greed, a final, grim tableau of a man and a sheep united in a watery grave. 9. The African savanna is a place of raw, untamed beauty, a photographer's paradise. For a wildlife filmmaker named David, it was also a place to push the boundaries of his craft. He was on a quest for the ultimate intimate camera angle, a shot so unique it would redefine wildlife cinematography. He found what he believed to be the perfect opportunity near a remote watering hole, a popular gathering spot for a local pride of lions. His big idea: he would hide inside a large hollowed-out log, placing it near the water's edge, and film the lions from a completely concealed, ground-level perspective. It was a risky, but in his mind, brilliant plan. He found the perfect log, spacious enough for him and his camera equipment, and dragged it into position. He crawled inside, set up his camera, and waited. As he had hoped, the lions, their thirst drawing them to the water, eventually approached. A few of the younger, more curious lions noticed the strange, new log. They approached it cautiously, sniffing at the opening. Then, their curiosity turned to playfulness. They began to bat at the heavy log with their massive paws, rolling it back and forth. Inside, David was probably thrilled. He was getting incredible once-in-a-lifetime footage, a lion's eye view of the world. The game escalated. With a powerful, coordinated push, the lions rolled the log directly into the watering hole. At first, this was not a disaster. The log floated, and David, though likely disoriented, was still relatively safe inside his wooden submarine. But the lions' game wasn't over. They continued to bat at the floating log, spinning it in the water. Then, with one final, playful push, they rolled it completely over. The log's only opening was now submerged, facing the muddy bottom of the watering hole. David was trapped. He was in a pocket of air, in a floating, upside-down tomb, just inches from the surface and the open sky. He was disoriented, in complete darkness, and he was unable to flip the heavy, now waterlogged log right side up by himself. The lions, their curiosity satisfied, eventually wandered off, leaving him to his fate. He had sought the ultimate, intimate shot of the wild, but he had become a part of it in the most tragic and ironic way possible. A victim not of a vicious attack, but of a playful and ultimately fatal game of cat and mouse. 10. In the sun-drenched, wellness-obsessed culture of Southern California, a man named Chad was a pioneer of a new and deeply misguided health trend of his own invention, the moon tan. He had become convinced that the gentle, silvery rays of the full moon held mystical, rejuvenating properties, far superior to the harsh, damaging rays of the sun. He believed that by bathing in moonlight, he could achieve a perfect, ethereal glow and absorb cosmic energy. To achieve the full, unadulterated effect, he decided he needed total, head-to-toe exposure. One warm, clear night, under the brilliant light of a full moon, he put his plan into action. He disrobed completely and, in pursuit of the perfect, unobstructed angle, he climbed onto the sloping roof of his two-story house. He laid down on the warm asphalt shingles, a naked suburban Icarus, and blissfully closed his eyes, ready to soak in the lunar radiance. The gentle warmth of the roof, the quiet hum of the city, and the serene, silvery light were a perfect, soothing combination. So soothing, in fact, that Chad, in his state of meditative bliss, promptly fell asleep. The human body, even in sleep, is not stationary. He shifted, he turned, and at some point in the night, he began to roll. The gentle, sloping angle of the roof, which had seemed so safe when he was awake, now became a slow, inexorable ramp to disaster. He rolled slowly, silently, towards the edge. He didn't fall onto the soft, forgiving bushes of his own yard. Instead, he rolled off the side of the house that bordered his neighbor's property, a property that was lined with a tall, decorative, and brutally sharp wrought iron fence. He fell 2 stories, his peaceful, lunar slumber ending in a sudden, violent, and horrific impalement upon the fence's sharp fleur-de-lis spears. He had wished to become one with the night, to absorb its mystical energy. In a grim, ironic way, he got his wish. His quest for a perfect, ethereal tan had ended in a dark, terrestrial, and very permanent conclusion. A final, brutal lesson that some wellness trends are best left unexplored. And that sleeping on a pitched roof is, and always will be, a catastrophically bad idea. Alright, that's our 10 for this round. But the well of human stupidity is bottomless. I know you've heard a story, a local legend, or seen a headline that belongs in one of these videos. What did I miss? Drop the craziest true story you know in the comments. If you enjoyed the show, prove you're one of the smart ones by hitting like and subscribing.